Ken, good afternoon. How are you?
Ciao Rico, come stai?
I'm good, I'm good. Listen, Ken, I come to your help because, as you know, having been many years in the rock industry, but I was this side of the pond, and I always admired a lot was what was happening back where you were. But
Yeah.
obviously, we've only the limited knowledge that we would get here from US bands because the information, there was no internet, only press releases, a few articles, and the eventual concerts, but with the top hit makers. I was always very fascinated about US music, and mostly I specialized in a sector which is slightly more obscure, which is garage punk, because I thought garage punk was really something that expressed very much the the freedom and the wildness of a youth and the expression of whatever they wanted to do at the time with their limited means. We here back in Europe, we had obviously very limited access to that music. And I believe that you, as a tremendous person that's been in the music industry forever, with tremendous encyclopedic knowledge of what makes and what doesn't make the rock industry, I'm going to start asking you to situate one of the albums I selected today, which for me I adore, but I know very little about. It's a band, I believe, from Boston area, from Massachusetts, and
US first pressing.
oh my God, you got even a better one.
That's some US mono. You've got a stereo, right?
I've got a stereo, so you got the better
That one's
one.
harder to find, but this one I bought 54 years ago.
And I
That's the
can
original.
see what a condition, man. What a
And to upset our dear friend Mikey, check this out.
oh,
Look
yeah.
at the condition.
Well, I couldn't really see, but I guess that it's like a mint minus.
And now you can see. Check this out, Ricardo. Reflecting you in it.
Yeah. Wow.
This is the mother lode. But before you can talk about that album, you have to talk about this album. That's
Yeah, which is, but it came out
Nuggets.
later, didn't it come out in the 70s, that one?
This is the mother lode. Okay? This is the one that started it all because the Remains were fundamentally regional. They broke out of New England, they made Hullabaloo, and they toured 19 dates with the Beatles.
Okay.
But they are thought of as mainly as a New England band. And referring back to what you said about the rarity of US stuff over here, it's because all of the bands on the Nuggets type thing, if you were smaller than the Beach Boys or the Byrds or even say the Turtles, you didn't get a UK tour or a French tour or a German tour. So all of the bands on Nuggets, if you look through, and these are all going to come up in our future conversations, I honestly doubt that the Third Rail or the Mojo Man or the Chocolate Watch Band ever toured. I mean, at least Europe. So you're not going to be able to say that you saw the Magicians or the Knickerbockers over here. In the same way that there were all sorts of British bands that didn't make the Invasion, which started bands like the Remains. When the Beatles kicked off all of this, and you have to give credit to the Beatles for the explosion in guitar bands with 4 or 5 members.
I give them
The only ones that made it to the States, they would have been like huge at the time. Dave Clark 5 would have toured the States, the Animals, the Rolling Stones. But the obscure little bands, I don't know. Did the Move ever make it to the States? I don't know. The thing is, every country has bands that never got to leave its shores. And for that matter, we know that Elvis Presley never toured because Colonel Tom Parker wouldn't let him, because Colonel Tom Parker was an illegal immigrant. But anyway, back to the Remains. The Remains were part of what you would call the first wave of Boston bands. Now, if we're talking about geography, what you have to appreciate is that Boston is like a second or third tier city. You've got LA at the top and tied with New York. Bubbling right under them is Chicago, but Boston is more regional. Now, what you also have to know about Boston is that it was a serious college town.
Okay.
And college towns always have a demand for bands to play fraternity houses, as everyone remembers from the movie Animal House. Those fraternity that sort of it's like the way the Catskills was for comedians. The circuit for fraternity house parties gave all sorts of bands their start, and it was easier to access those than, say, clubs. But the Remains had a great Boston club scene. Now, when the Remains came along, they were one-hit wonders. If you weren't from New York or LA, you would be a one-hit wonder, and you would start out regional. You could have been in Ohio, you could have been in Texas. The Remains happened to be in Boston. But what makes them different from all of the others is the stroke of luck that got them on tour with the Beatles.
Okay.
Now, usually if you toured with the Beatles in the States, you were something like the Ronettes, which were huge. And if you want to know about that, because I'm not going to take up the hour with this, you have to buy this book. This book, can you see it?
Very well. The Ticket to Ride, yeah, the extraordinary, is it post-Beatles or Beatles?
This is about the 1966 tour that when the Beatles, is it 66? Yeah, this is the tour in which the Remains opened up for the Beatles for 19 dates. And Barry Tashian was the main member of the Remains. And he wrote this 30 years after the fact. So if you can find this, not only will you find out what it's like to have toured with the Beatles, you'll also have pretty much the story of the Remains. Because what you have to realize is that the Remains, who are one of those cult bands where the reputation they have now is far greater than when they existed, the Remains were only around for about 3 years. They actually broke up before that album came out. That album came out right after they split up.
Oh, I see.
There was a number of reasons why they broke up, but the other thing is that the main person that they lost was the drummer Chip Damiani, who was replaced by N.D. Smart on the sleeve. So this guy here, N.D. Smart, which is this chap, he replaced Damiani, but Barry Tashian said that the real band had to include Chip. This is not to denigrate the work of N.D. Smart, because N.D. Smart is one of those guys who turned up everywhere. He was in Kangaroo. He worked with Graham Parsons, I believe. I think he'd had a little time with the Flying Burrito Brothers, and he definitely was in the lineup of Mountain before Corky Lang, so he played with Leslie West. N.D. Smart is one of those guys like that Woody Allen character who happened to be in the right place throughout history. He's a fantastic drummer. And he's only on 3 or 4 of the tracks, but people have to be very careful when they criticize him, because one of their most important tracks, which is Don't Look Back, that was, which is here on Nuggets, Don't Look Back, doesn't have Chip. It's got N.D. Smart, if I remember correctly. Anyway, when I was growing up, and I'm not going to lie and say that I saw the Remains, because when they split up, I was only 14. I'm not one of those psychotics who claims that they were at Woodstock when they were on the other side of the country, or these posers who say they were at Studio 54 when they weren't even born yet. No, I never got to see the Remains live. But because I only lived 100 miles north of them, at 2 years later, 3 years later, I was seeing all the Boston bands that were inspired by the Remains or were contemporaries of the Remains. So you had the Rockin' Ramrods, you had the Lost, you had the Jay Giles Band, which was in the generation right after. People forget about that. But then it was before Boston really, really cracked it wide open. You have to look at the Jay Giles Band in the early 70s and the Cars. The Cars were probably the biggest band to come out of Boston. Going back to the Remains, though, the Remains were a real club-type band, and they played hard rock. They are, to me, the quintessential garage band. But there's another big difference in the. Sorry, Ricardo.
Tell me, no, thank you, because this is very informative for me. I've always felt that, of course, there was the inspiration, and you mentioned the Beatles, of the beach and the Great British Invasion. But I just thought that maybe was there something that made American youth slightly more adventurous and slightly wilder, that garage punk ended up being much louder and much more raw than we had it back in the UK at the time?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. The first thing is bands like the Beatles, the Animals, the Stones, they were reinterpreting American music at the beginning. You know, before the Beatles wrote their own stuff and before the Stones wrote their own stuff, they weren't covering the Shadow. Well, the Beatles did cover one Shadow song, a Writer Shadow song, Cry for a Shadow. I think George wrote it. But basically, they weren't covering Billy Fury. They sure as hell weren't covering Tommy Quickly or Tommy Steele. Those guys were looking to Motown, U.S. soul, blues, and American rock. They all worshipped Roy Orbison. They all worshipped Carl Perkins. So and Elvis, of course, and Buddy Holly Buddy Holly. Yeah, and Buddy Holly had more influence over all of the British bands than anyone. The Beatles named themselves after the Beatles after crickets. The Hollies called themselves the Hollies, so I don't even want to go there. But Buddy Holly and the Crickets are the definitive birth point, creation point for guitar-led self-contained bands. Anyway, the British had to be less adventurous than the Americans for a number of reasons, not least being lower disposable incomes, fewer venues in which to play, less freedom in so many ways. You know, the generation on the 50s, I'll give you a perfect example that's concrete. When the British were lucky enough to be able to afford a single or an EP, an American kid was buying an LP because they had more disposable income. When the British kids were ruining their albums on dansets and pie black boxes, most American kids' families had a proper stereo. So there were these big differences that I'm not saying that American kids were spoiled, but they were certainly more privileged. And also, you cannot undervalue what existed before the Beatles. Now, everyone likes to think that the period between Elvis going into the army and the Beatles arriving was a really dark, crappy period, 59, 60 to 64. But during that period was the peak of Roy Orbison, the Everly Brothers. These guys inspired the Beatles too. And anyone who criticizes the Everly Brothers, Johnny Rivers, people like that, is just a tasteless idiot.
And what about the Kingsmen? Where do they fit in all that? The Kingsmen, for example, that was about that.
Well, no, the Kingsmen, this is part of it. You see, the Kingsmen, early Paul Revere and the Raiders, the Beach Boys, all of the surf bands, these guys predated the Beatles. You got to remember, not every band that came out in the States followed the Beatles. The Byrds will be the first to admit that it was the Beatles who inspired them. And back to the Remains started in 64, but these guys were already serious musicians, and Boston had already had a scene. These guys weren't ones who picked up their guitars the week before, like those idiotic British punks in the 70s who couldn't play a note. These guys were serious musicians, and the proof is in the pudding. If you go past the Remains, Barry Tashian was Emmylou Harris's guitarist, I believe. I think it was Barry as well as N.D. Smart worked with Graham Parsons. And, you know, Tashian is still around. He's one of the top country players. That's another thing about the Remains. They're looked upon as garage, but on that first album, they had the guts to cover Lonely Weekend, which was a Charlie Rich country thing. You know, these guys had taste. They were doing a bit of R&B. And there's a saying that the best stuff that they did, I think it was one of the great writers like John Landau, one of the great critics, said that their best stuff never made it to record because there's only the one studio album. But as you've held up and you know, you've got things like that was discovered later. You've got this one, Live in Boston from '66.
Well, is that actually an issue on one of the later labels, or is that on?
This is French. This came from one of the French labels. This is from.
Wow, I've never heard that album. Wow.
FGL, yeah, and this is from '66. The Live in '66, because Eva Records brought out an amazing album. You've got. Let's see, this one from Eva in France.
Oh yeah, that one I have. Yeah. Yeah.
Then you've got this one here on Spoonfed from 1978. So the cult started early, you know, and this is the one to buy now, which came out more recently from Sundays. This is the new version or the later version of the mono plus a bonus album. So there's plenty of stuff out there, but the real killer, if you want to hear what this is the one. This is the one to get. Live '69. They reformed for a very short time, and it shows you how amazing they were.
Well, Ken, this is gonna get me shopping today because A lot of these titles I don't have. Well,
Well, and I'm missing a few too, but you see, the problem with the remains, and if you look at the CDs, this one, which is the CD version that I just showed you, but stereo, not mono.
Yeah.
You've got this one, which the same label, Epic, put out before. You've got this one from New Rose. And you've got this one, this is the CD version. You've got this on vinyl, Ricardo.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
All of them have different tracks, so you need all of them. And there's a few more out there that you can't get because a lot of these are out of print. But if you're only going to get one, I recommend this one on either vinyl or CD. That gives you the studio album plus enough outtakes to give you an idea. But then the live stuff, if you're that hard, become that much of a hardcore member. Anyway, so here you've got a band.
My limited knowledge, I want to ask you something because I always remember a fantastic anecdote from another US garage band when the Monks went to Hamburg to play in the clubs. All the Beat Generation was going there at the same time, and some of the UK bands. So the public in the clubs were quite used to loud guitars and good rock music. But
Yeah.
when the Monks came to these clubs, everybody left the club. And you know why they left the club? Because the music was so loud that even the youth there was not used to that amazing, raw, fantastic energy. And it's only later, obviously, that they became very famous. So would you say the Remains were part of this group of loud, energetic Boston style band for the period?
Well, I have to surprise here because, as I said, I never saw them live. Now, when you on the few occasions I did go down to Boston and go to the clubs, there was that vibe, like they said, applied to all the clubs that the Beatles played in, and like the Marquee in London, that they were small and sweaty and packed out. Like the Cavern, they talked about it dripping off the walls, and the bands did play loud. And I'm talking about, I saw, for example, the Nervous Eaters. Wow. In 72 in Boston. I think it was at the Rathskeller. I think it was still open, but it was certainly in a club, and it would have been loud. And if you listen to either of those two live Remains albums, they were definitely given it some. But I have to keep on repeating that the reason why they became a cult and what lifts them out of the garage thing is they were astonishing musicians. Now, a lot of the tracks are pretty simplistic, but it's until you listen to them, especially if you get a hold of the stereo and listen into it. These guys were really studio savvy. They weren't just 4 or 5 kids pulled off the street by some producer who saw potential. These were pros. So what you've got is the energy of like a 16-year-old punk type mentality, but played with quality. None of this crap like the Sex Pistols. These guys could really, really play. Now, that's not totally fair because the Pistols weren't as bad as they wanted people to think. I don't believe Sid Vicious bought his guitar the day before they went into the studio. But on the other hand, when you listen to the first stuff by the Beatles and the Stones and the Yardbirds, and by the same token, the Remains, you know that these guys put their time in for years in the clubs before they ever got in front of a microphone. See, the Remains also had their colleagues. They had bands like The Lost, Teddy and the Pandas, the Improper Bostonians, the Rockin' Ramrods. These are the ones that predated the Jay Giles Band and certainly the Cars. The Cars are definitely 8 to 10 years younger in terms of the age of the players. What we're not talking about here is the other element of Boston, which was sort of a misstep, and it's very important on the geographical and political thing. I know you remember, Ricardo, because I know you've got albums by the Beacon Street Union, Eden's Children, Earth Opera. This was this thing called the Bosstown Sound, because San Francisco, which is very much a West Coast equivalent of Boston culturally, super left wing, full of restaurants, full of students, full of drugs, blah, blah, blah. MGM had offices in New York, and they were seeing all this money going into San Francisco for equally crappy bands. Like, no one can tell me that the early Jefferson Airplane albums and Grateful Dead albums are highlights of musicianship. But the whole San Francisco scene was massive. It was massive. And you had everything from weird psychedelic to neoclassical, what I would call pre-prog rock. But Boston, in fact, the parallel, the Remains were to the Boston scene what the Beau Brummels were to the San Francisco scene. They were just ahead of the hype. In other words, the Beau Brummels, who were the best band ever to come out of San Francisco, were derided because they had hits. These guys could play circles around all of that other hippie garbage. The Remains were pre-Bosstown sound, and it's a good thing because all of the Boston bands like Ultimate Spinach and Beacon Street Union, the rock press immediately attacked them as pure hype. Now, if you listen to the records years later, they were absolutely right. That stuff is utter garbage, and you can't listen to it unless you're doing heavy drugs. It really is dire stuff. But yeah, they're $500 a copy now. And, I mean, have you ever sat through it, Ricardo, without wanting to get up?
Nowadays, it's impossible.
You want to put a gun in your mouth. It's really vile. Whereas the Remains played songs, you skip the Bosstown sound, and then you get to the Jay Giles Band, which is one of the best party R&B sweaty bands in history. And I think there's more of a link between the Remains and the Jay Giles Band. And Peter Wolf, I think, acknowledges that the Remains and the Lost were the real core of the whole Boston thing, with the Bosstown sound just being some weird diversion. The Cars is a totally different thing because they were totally technoid. Yeah, that was real studio stuff. But the Remains, I was in Portland, which is 2 hours north of Boston, and you used to hear about this incredible band, and you wanted them to come up to play in Portland. And as I said, I must have heard the Rockin' Ramrods 4 or 5 times, Jay Giles Band 6 or 7 times, Improper Bostonians 2 or 3 times. I even saw Fluff and Orpheus and the Orphans and all sorts of Boston bands. A lot came out of it. But the thing with the Remains that's so intriguing is that they became a cult band like Love, or the Nas, that without ever actually having that much output to work on. You see, when you talk about Love, and they weren't really appreciated until long after they split up, they did a half dozen albums, easily. The whole thing of the Remains rests on 12 to 10? One album with 10 tracks. That's the whole reputation of them, is based on 10 tracks on the original track listing. But what happened was, thanks to Nuggets, people started looking into it. Because if you play Nuggets, Don't Look Back is one of the tracks that just jumps out at you. Not every track and every band on Nuggets is brilliant. There's some real garbage on there. But then you get something like Nas, Open My Eyes, and you have to sit back and go, wow. And Don't Look Back was the one that made them. But the funny thing is, I seem to recall that the big number that everyone knew from the Remains was Diddy Wah Diddy. Now, I don't have their singles, and I wasn't buying their singles at the time. But I think Diddy Wah Diddy was the first song of theirs that I heard, and it was the one that seemed to be their signature tune.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, the one that probably made them more famous. But we have to realize that is relatively famous because it never really crossed. Mind you, I think they got famous outside Boston after.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean,
well, it was the Beatles tour. The Beatles tour spread the word,
yeah. And
Epic was interested in pushing them, but unfortunately, as I said earlier, they broke up at the worst time possible. But as I said, at least Barry Tashian, certainly Andy Smart went on to have full careers in the music industry. But the cult thing, it didn't happen immediately. And the irony is, and this is what supports your whole raison d'etre for this Zoom, is that it was the French cult, rock cult fans, the French specifically, like I think Eva Records is French. These were the labels that were digging up this stuff for the same reasons you said. They would hear about it. Remember, this is before the internet. So someone would bring along a copy of, say, the East Village Other or the Village Voice or an early copy of Cream or Crawdaddy magazine, and they'd read this wonderful article about some band like Auto Salvage, and they go, well, we can't get that here. It's not released here. The band's never played here. We got to find out more about this. So when Nuggets came along, that became a blueprint for every French, German, Italian, Dutch rock fan. That gave them a shopping list. And again, if you play Nuggets, that's the one that stands out. But then another thing, honestly, you have to put this into context. A lot of people, I would call it reverse engineer. Now, I didn't discover Buddy Holly because of Buddy Holly. He died when I was 7. I discovered Buddy Holly because I fell in love with the track Words of Love when the Beatles put it on Beatles 6. And I had to find out who this guy Buddy Holly was. Now, you imagine someone who's into Emmylou Harris and Graham Parsons, and they keep seeing this name Barry Tashian. Then they go on to Wikipedia and find out that the Remains were his first band. Now, the Remains are nothing like what these guys are doing with Graham Parsons, with the Flying Burrito Brothers, or any of those.
No.
But you got a genius musician. And as I said, you got to really look into the discography of N.D. Smart, will blow your mind.
Well, I have to say, sorry,
Take it.
I have to say that I love the word reverse engineering because I must say it's something that I've been doing myself, and I thank you guys. As you know, I've got a friend in Holland as well that helps me and inspires me, and you, of course, with your great knowledge, to reverse engineer and discover these incredible bands from the US. Now, one thing I wanted, because we're limited in time, Ken, but we'll have more sessions that will cover more states. Can you tell me what the social political background would have been in that in Massachusetts and more specifically Boston in that specific time?
Okay, Boston at that specific time, as opposed to now where every city is homogenized and the sort of the ghettos are disappearing unless it's a huge segment like the Latino part of LA. At the time, you had African-American neighborhoods in the sort of Somerville, Roxbury, but Boston itself was pretty evenly divided with Irish, huge Irish population. I think the North Shore was Italian and strong Jewish population. So if you look through that, you had 4 distinct ethnic types, but the real glue that put all of this together was the universities. Boston is easily one of the 10 most important cities on the planet for number of students and number of universities. I know London is bigger, but Boston is 1/10 of the size. But look what you had. You have Harvard, you had MIT, Simmons, BU, I think Tufts, Brandeis, whatever. You had more universities there, and top universities, not agricultural colleges where schmucks like I ended up. And you had a demand for live music in restaurants and clubs that these guys were feeding. And I don't remember it as being torn with race riots. I don't remember it being particularly violent. It certainly didn't have the crime levels of New York, not even in the same ratio. Yes, there were certain areas you didn't go to, like any areas in the United States in the early 60s. If you were Italian and you were going over to the Irish neighborhood, hey, we're talking the West Side Story, where you got gangs and so on and so forth. But it wasn't as bad as it is now with everyone carrying AK-47s. So what you had was a really vibrant intellectual city, probably liberal because of the heavy university element. And it was a melting pot that some of those early Boston bands were mixed race. And at the time, you just didn't have that. Yeah, everyone likes to think it was Sly and the Family Stone. No, or the Chambers Brothers. It took a lot of guts to have a mixed race band at the time. And 1 or 2 of the Boston bands were like that. So it was a cool city.
Very, very interesting what you just said. This is what interests me because I think that these sounds that I like to hear through a good audio system, and as you know, I'm not very keen on audiophile records as such, because I think music should be played as it is, raw, and accept the engineering of the recording engineer. But definitely, I think that these sounds reflect, in a way, in my mind, a little bit the social political climate of the town, and maybe be quite avant-garde in the case of the remains, because from what you say, it was quite conservative, effectively, but with
Well, if you look at the members, I think the name Chip Damiani suggests Italian. Barry Tashian could be Armenian, perhaps. So you've got a little mix right there. The other thing you have to remember is that Boston had one or two great radio stations, and if you lived in Boston, you could always pick up New York. In the same way that Londoners were getting the pirate stations, and the other thing you got
oh,
to
I'm so
remember is
sorry.
that's all right. That's when you're popular. What happens? You got to remember that in the middle of Boston was Cambridge, like a little oasis right in the middle of the city. That was almost entirely students, with Harvard Square, great record stores, great hi-fi stores. So Boston's an amazing music city. The odd thing is that it never had the same status as New York, L.A., Chicago, or New Orleans, or Memphis. Those are and Nashville. Those six are the U.S. heart. Detroit is more in line in terms of influence. Boston's more like Detroit, a smaller city, more niche, but the bands that came out of it were phenomenal. And with the Remains, they're still gigging.
I
There's a
know,
very
I've seen a reunion of them,
playing.
and the guy was saying, I'm detuning my guitar. I loved it, because that's what all garage punk is about. Ken, I'm
Well, we
afraid.
have to get our hands. I know we got to go, but my parting shot is we got to get our hands. There was a documentary made about them for, I believe, HBO or MTV, and it's called America's Great Lost Band. And
Oh,
I
wow.
haven't seen it, but it's the story of the Remains, and they were the greatest of the
Oh,
lost
wow.
bands.
That's worth these last 30 seconds.
Without any question, of all the bands that just didn't reach the potential, the ones that had the most potential were these guys. I love the Sopwith Camel. I love Poco. There's a billion bands I could name that never reached what they should have. But the Remains are the ones that said, what if?
And the great thing about the Remains for me is that it's fantastic, simple, but very well orchestrated music, and you can play it again and again. And unlike the ultimate spinach, it's ageless.
Yeah.
You'll be able to play it in 10 years and it will still be good.
And as the name goes, it remains.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Ken. Really appreciate it.